Hello and welcome to another week of Sandman Reading Club. I am your co-host, Peter, and on the other side of the camera and world from me is my co-host, Faria. Faria, say hello to everybody.
Hi everyone, how are you all?
We're so happy to be back tonight. We're going to be talking about Sandman 2, 3, and 4, which kind of explores his going back to the dream world and looking for 2 of his 3 tools. But before we do that, I thought it would be good if people read number 1 a while ago or just haven't read number 1 and are jumping right in, if we could just recap where we stand right now as we're beginning issue 2. So I'm going to hand it over to Faria to do that.
So the issue 1 of Sandman was kind of like we talked about it last week. It's all about his capture by the Burgess, and how he broke free from it. We get to see a little bit of all his powers, sort of like a very like a sneak peek of it. And then as he escapes, we get to see a little bit more of of him. So the thing is that that's one of the reasons like issue 2, 3, and 4 kind of explore that a little bit more and extend on his story or his lore a little bit. So and so I'm very excited to talk about that today.
Yeah, and I think partially because, again, I'm coming to Sandman with so much weight on my back of having heard of Sandman and having read a little bit of Sandman, and Sandman as this cultural phenomenon over 20 years from it being over. And I think issue 1 didn't have a lot of dream in it. So I got to issue 2 and I was like, oh, good, we're going to get to read about him and see what he does and see this dream world. So I was incredibly, incredibly eager to dig into this and get past where we started last time.
Right. And for a lot of new readers, I think issue 1 is kind of like a litmus test. If you can, if you like issue 1, you're going to love the rest of the story. I personally feel that way. So, if issue 1 made you think, oh, let's see what happens after that, you're in for it.
Awesome. Well, let's dig into issue 2. So before we get into it, high level, what is issue 2? What is the story in this issue?
So issue 2, Sandman now travels to his world. I think it's called a dream world, and to find that it's all in a disarray because he's been gone for 80 plus years. And right. While he was gone, all his minions kind of left their posts and everything. His castle's in ruins. A couple of characters sticks around, but he's now he finds that it wasn't very what he would think that it would be left behind, and so he then decides that, okay, it's time to get my tools back and get this all up and running again. So that's what kind of issue 2 was at.
And it starts with this very strange sequence that, even though it's only 3 pages long, it takes a little while to click and you realize what's happening, which is these 2 brothers, and one of them is being given a gift, and he says it's not his birthday, and the one is quite tentative, and the other one seems quite sinister. Did you, in your reread, did you already remember who these characters were? Because it was new to me, and I didn't know kind of the joke of it until I got to the end of the sequence.
So the only reason I remembered it because these 2 characters actually shows up later. So for those of us those of you who already read it, it's they're the brother Abel and Cain. So there's the oldest biblical story you can find. Cain is considered the first murderer. In no matter what religious denomination you're looking at, their stories always stays the same. So Cain murdered Abel after his sacrifice was not accepted by God. So, and that's when the whole idea of murder came about, and he is considered to be the first murderer. And even in this one, that theme continues because they're 2 brothers, and they're kind of in here. They're I guess they works for a dream, and it's all that relationship kind of exists that Cain always murders Abel at the end of the issue.
It's they're stuck in a loop. I think it's so interesting because you refer to Cain as the first murderer, and that's something that's common across all fiction, is that he's known as that way. But Abel calls himself the first victim in this story, and or he's the victim of the first story, which I think we'll get into in a little bit. And it was intriguing to me that people that manifest once, perhaps as real people, or maybe this is just kind of the narrative version of them, now that they're in the dream world, just have to play out their thing over and over again. Because isn't that a lot just like a normal dream? Like we all have dreams where we play out recurring themes, or like late to class, or we see something we meant to buy. And I don't know, these are my dreams. I dream about being late to class and toys that I didn't buy as a child. I'm sure we could get Freudian on that. But I don't know, I thought that was really interesting how they have a recurrence. Like they're not allowed to really develop as people because they kind of keep getting reset back to first murder or first victim.
So I think like that's the curse of Cain, though, because when he murdered his brother, I think that's what he was cursed for, that he will never die and he will live out rest of eternity as like, you know, in a constant loop of his life. So I don't know whether that's what Gaiman got inspiration from.
Oh.
You know, and those of you, if you're interested into reading more about Abel and Cain, there is a very interesting graphic novel called The Goddamned by Jason Aaron. There's
I've never read that.
Yeah, it's all about Cain. He's the protagonist of it, and it's crazy visual. If not for the story, just get it for the visual alone. It's like the world full of violence. So anyway, I don't want to digress into that, but
no, yes. I kind of love when we find other like kind of modern-ish comic books that we refer to the way we were talking about Umbrella Academy last week. So I love that. I think it would be fun. I'm not going to guarantee we can figure it out every episode, but I love when we have little nods to other stuff.
Right. No, as I was reading that, I was oh yes, you know. I mean, when I was reading Goddamn, that's when I kind of remembered that these two characters shows up in the Sandman. And I think there's another one I recently read that Abel and Cain is also I think in the Preacher as well. There is mention of them and there too. So yeah, they're a very integral part of if you have any kind of religious fiction, you know, they're a very integral part to that. So and obviously these two characters come back at later issues as well. So they're important players for you to remember.
And I actually I really love religious fiction, which is strange, but that's a topic for another time. So I'm really excited that this theme will come back, because I think it textually gives you a lot to dig into. And actually that ties to the thing I want to talk about here, which is that they call it the first story. And you know, we've only had one episode with Dream so far, but I don't think get the sense that he's necessarily the Prince of Stories in that issue. But here there's this kind of like analog that, like, if it has been a story, does that also make it a dream? Like, can you have stories without having dreamed first? Can you have dreams without the ability to tell a story? And is he, in a way, the king of both?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I didn't actually thought about that in that way. But I think, like, anytime someone creates a story, it's someone's dream to tell that story, dream in air quote, to tell that story, and then he owns it. I think that's something that there is a later issue. I don't remember, like, you know, in very late in the story, but there's like one writer who was given a character by Dream who became his muse, and he could write as great stories as possible. I think he's supposed to be a Shakespeare analog.
Oh yeah. Or something, I think it might actually literally be Shakespeare, but we'll get there.
Yeah, that's true. So we can discuss that later. So there is, I think, a theme of that as well, that all stories are owned by him. So that comes back a lot.
Now we get a brief interlude here before we go back to the dream world. We have Dream kind of like convalescing. They've set him up in bed, and he asks, actually before the interlude, he asks for their letters of commission, because there's this sense that anything that exists in the dream world is made up of some portion of Dream himself. It's sort of like Horcruxes in Harry Potter. And so if they can return them to him, that will give him some of his essence back, which he lacks so much of right now. And I guess since they were the people from the first story, they are some of the oldest pieces of Dream, I guess.
Yeah, you can read it in that way. That's actually a very interesting point. But one thing I actually really liked about this particular issue was this page over here, while he comes out of a frame. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Like, you know, he comes out of a frame. I kind of really like this aspect of Sandman. Is like a lot of things happens in the background that you kind of have to really pay attention to. And this is something that's like really cool in the sense, like, you know, things that, like, you know, it feels like a moving picture instead of like just like a stationary panel. So I was kind of like, I saw it today as, like, you know, when I was kind of getting ready for the thing, I'm like, I didn't see it the 3 times I read this. Today was the first time I saw this.
And I think it was actually you started your reread before I decided it was time for me to finally read this. And you had made a comment like, I never knew the first time how many of these little things there were. And that's what really inspired me to read it, because I feel like I've become so much more literate in comics in the last 3 or 4 years than I was before. And certainly than I was in the 90s, the few times I like paged through Sandman. And I don't feel like it's a story that requires you to be literate in all these things, because it could also be the gateway to learning about them. But all these little background hints and Easter eggs and references to Cain and Abel and Shakespeare and everything, I think is part of the fun of this book. It's just packed with material.
Right. And to me, that's like an achievement on its own, because how did Gaiman remembered all of this and decided to use them? To me, it's like, I'm not that, I myself is not that, creative. So to me, it's like, I always get like wowed by that. Another panel, page of this particular issue that I actually kind of talked about it in our group as well, is this one over here. So as you can see, there's the 3 sisters that shows up later. Mm-hmm. And what I really liked is like the way they use the 3 panels to show that the sisters are interchangeable. Because if you look at this one over here, like she is first the crone and she's holding the frog. In the next one, she becomes the mother and she's kind of halfway swallowing it. And then finally she becomes the maiden and then finished eating the frog. I thought this was a very clever way of showing it, because I don't know how else, they could have done that. So that to me, that stuck to my head, because when I came back to it, I'm like, oh yeah, that happened.
Well, that's actually one of the pages I think is the most interesting and probably the most well-known of the pages in this one, because they're meant to be the 3 fates or 3 furies, but in that page and the page before it, much like with Cain and Abel, Sandman plays with their identity and the permanence of their identity. So he runs through a number of different names. Morpheus greets them by saying, Lady Atropos, you have found me out. I do want something. To which the crone at that point replies, Atropos, no, not now. You might as well call me the Morgan. So I kind of went digging through this. So Atropos is one of the 3 Moirae in Greek mythology. They're the goddesses of fate and destiny. So that's Atropos, Clotho, and Lachesis. Then there's the Erinyes, or the Furies of the Aeneid, which are the ones I'm more familiar with, and that's Tisiphone, Alecto, and Megaria. And then later, I want to see if you got this reference, because this is the only one that I knew without looking it up. He calls them Diana, Mary, and Florence. Do you know what that refers to?
No.
It's much more modern.
So go ahead, explode my mind.
Diana, Mary, and Florence are the Supremes. Diana Ross and the Supremes, and I think that's funny, because he's playing with this idea of like this trio of women who are storytellers, maybe who control our fates, but are part of kind of the popular mythology. And how different is pop music really from the popular mythology of the Furies and the Aeneid? So I thought that was, I really delighted in that. And I hope he continues to do that, because I feel like they've got to show up again at some point. And I hope he plays with that.
I think they do. And the thing is, oh my God, considered my mind explode, that there was all these different, it feels like their story is everlasting. So it's like, no matter what century you're in, you're going to find these 3 sisters in their story.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I got so excited because I'm about to talk about something you know a lot about. Isn't that so similar to the portrayal of the gods in American Gods?
It is, because the thing is, like, the gods changes because the modern gods are TV, internet, and you have to apologize because I have read it so long ago, so I have like distant like bits and pieces in my head. So the thing is, like, what I remember that it was, they were trying to show that, oh, the newer gods are bad and compared to the older gods. To me, it's like, is it? Because ultimately, God is made by humans, right? Like, if you give something that much thought to it, yeah, they will become, you put them in a higher pedestal and you start worshiping it. So it's nothing bad or good about it, if you know what I mean. Once again, I digress, sorry.
But I think it's interesting because he does something a little bit different in Sandman, in that the Endless are sort of these universal forces, right? Like it almost doesn't matter what humans want from them. It's in human nature to have them, right? Like, oh God, I don't know if I could do all 7. I have them written down on my notepad somewhere here. Dream, desire, destruction, destiny, delirium, death, and maybe that was 7. But the point is that they're kind of these overarching forces. And then, but within Sandman's world, he's got these people who have kind of narrative consistency. The first murderer, the first victim, the kind of 3 women storytellers. And I think that that's like, it's a more of a, it adds more levels and hierarchy to this idea of gods, that they're kind of the all persisting concepts. And then there are the persisting narratives, which are more dependent on humans to kind of like define them and continue their narrative tradition over the years.
So that kind of brings up the chicken and the egg analogy of it. Which came first? Does human has all these things because they exist? Endless existed before them, or Endless was kind of created because of not human, maybe some other sentient beings created them.
Yeah, and I think, especially with Cain and Abel on the table, that brings up an interesting question about like death and destruction. If we're to understand that some form of religious myth is at the basis of stories like Sandman, then there was some point of human history that existed before sin, theoretically, and like, was there death and destruction at that point? And how dependent are these like universal forces on man or some form of sentient life existing?
So the thing is, like in this particular issue, they show Green Lantern in one of the.
I was just going to talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Green Lantern. So if Green Lantern exists, that means the Guardians exist. So if the Guardians exist, what's their relationship with the Endless? I kind of thought about that a little bit, because the thing is, like, if Guardians are supposed to be the first, force that was there, I think John's Green Lantern kind of explores that theme a little bit more. So it's like, did the Endless exist then? And how is their relationship with them?
Yeah, I'm sure there's many people at DC Comics right now who would love to launch a 12-issue maxi series explaining that. That will ship slightly late in the middle. I want to talk about one more thing from issue 2, and then if anybody in the chat has questions or points from issue 2, Philip had some really interesting things going along with our discussion of gods as symbols that I'll come back to. But so you mentioned Green Lantern. We see him in the context of the 3 fates or furies. Each one of them divulges one of the places where Sandman's tools exist. So we learned that his pouch of sand is somehow linked to John Constantine. We learned that his helm has passed to a demon. And then finally that his ruby is in the hands of a supervillain. And earlier in the issue, we actually get an interlude with this villain and his mother visiting Arkham. Do you have anything you want to talk about with that?
Well, one thing I can tell you, in issue 5 and 6, he becomes a crazy person, and he's heavily featured in issue 5, 6, and 7, and so we will see a little bit more on that. However, so it's like a little bit of like teaser for you guys. However, I tried to look for him if he's actually included in DC proper. So I think in the Crisis of Infinite Earth, I think he's mentioned by name, but it's not. He never. I don't think he's actual villain. Like I think he's like a Sandman original. I think, but someone can correct me on that, because that's what I read when I tried to look him up a little bit, because I wanted to see that. Okay, so if there's an actual panel here that shows that Batman and Green Lantern apprehending him, how did that happen? I thought there was some some DC story related to that. I couldn't find anything. So
he is a pre-crisis character. So he first appeared in Justice League of America #5 in 1961, a story titled When Gravity Went Wild. And he appears sporadically throughout the 60s. And then he's kind of tabled and doesn't really make another appearance until he's in Black Orchid, also by Sandman, and then he appears in Arkham Asylum. So it's interesting that that he is one of these characters that kind of gets co-opted by the early Vertigo brand. And Alan Moore did a similar thing in Swamp Thing, where he kind of like took a few characters that had been like way off to the side of the DC universe and made them relevant again in this more adult fashion. And I think none more prominent to me than Animal Man. You know, I have a guide page for Animal Man on Crushing Crisis, and in doing that, I went through all of his appearances, and he barely existed pre-Crisis. Like, his stories were so few and so lightweight that it's not like there's any pre-reading you really can do before Grant Morrison's Animal Man, save for maybe like one arc. He has a hilarious 2-part story with Wonder Woman that I like. But I think it's interesting how Moore, Morrison, Gaiman are doing this. They, you know, back in the age before you could just digitally buy a whole series, that they were enough students of the comic medium that they were picking out these characters that had appeared like 3 times in the 1960s to develop their mythology and connect these more adult, more arcane titles to the main DC universe.
Okay, because I was kind of looking for that story, that how did he came, like how did Justice League apprehended him and got the ruby back, but that was never kind of like, I don't think that was ever written.
Yeah, I don't know. It's actually really interesting. It's one of my favorite things actually in world building, when the author introduces little details like that with so much authenticity that you question yourself, like, has that really happened? Or did they just make that up on the spot? And I think comic fans fall into the trap of like wanting an editorial box that says, this happened in issue number 32 of blah, blah, blah. And I caught myself even doing that in a comic I was reading earlier today. But I love that it's just left to our imagination. Like that, then if you really want to know, go buy the annotated Sandman or whatever and find out. But in the context of this, it doesn't matter if it really happened or not, because it has a ring of like veracity to it.
Right. So like, you know, that kind of like Gaiman does that a lot. He makes things sound like, oh, this is real, and then you're like, no, it's not. You just made that up. So I don't know whether that's a sign of a great storyteller, that you can, you know, convince people that these are all real things, you know, that happened. So, you know, I found that to be a little interesting.
Well, it's also emblematic of how Gaiman and Sandman are analogs, right? Like Sandman is drawn to look like Neil Gaiman, but Neil Gaiman is doing the very thing that Sandman does in this issue. He draws all of these disparate parts from narratives, biblical narratives, superhero narratives, things that he's just made up on the spot. And it's kind of this very interesting parallel of character and author. Even though I don't think Gaiman really ever uses him as a self-insert, he kind of does represent that because of the nature of the story that Gaiman is telling. It's very metatextual. Like, he's telling a story that can only exist in the framework of the kind of story that his character can create.
Yeah. Well, the last thing before we move on to the next issue, is that the last page was so heartbreaking. The one that, you know, the Abel kind of sitting and talking to his gift, or like a little pet, and then, you know, he was like, especially when it's like nice and kindly brotherly, it made my heart break all over again, because, you know, he's so sad. I wanted to go and hug him. So that's kind of like, you know, where I'm gonna end with this, because ultimately it was about like, they tried to, he was killed because of the naming of the gift of the bird. So, you know, I thought that it was very like that's something, a common theme. Like, every issue is kind of left with a little bit of either heartbreak or like, you know, out of the world horror story. So
I agree. And he's kind of like very sadly childlike and pathetic throughout the issue. It's like they've been intensified. As the first victim, he's been like infantilized, and as the first murderer, you know, his brother has become very cunning and sinister. Even if they didn't start out that way, it's like the extreme versions of themselves. I want to go to a couple comments from the chat before we move on to issue number 3. So Philip Evans, when we were talking about the gods and the gods as symbols, he says our concepts would change with time. Like many stories where the gods draw power from their followers, the concepts take on different or new symbols, which I think is a really nice boiled down version of something that took us quite a few minutes to say. Stephen asked if it was Sandman's first appearance in Sandman 1. Yes, Morpheus is Sandman, because Gaiman is his creator and the creator of the Endless, although we do get hints of the Wesley Dodds Golden Age Sandman in issue 1, and even though he didn't really have powers of an Endless, I know that he gets kind of linked in different ways throughout the series. And commiseration over the last page. I think that's all we've got in issue 2. So Freya, why don't you tell us about issue number 3?
So issue number 3 is our first ever, first cameo in like this series that's filled with so many of them. It's John Constantine. Am I saying it right?
Yes.
So yeah, okay. So when I first read it, I had no like I didn't make the connection that this is the same John Constantine, and
Oh,
that's
interesting.
that's totally on me and my brain not connecting things properly, because I love John Constantine from every appearance he made in any of the animated version of DC, and he's one of my favorite character because of his like all his posh Englishness and all that, and like especially with his cigar, like just like I love him. So the fact that I didn't make this connection is an ultimate failure on me. So from the three sisters in the previous issue, Sandman finds out, Dream finds out that John Constantine may know where his pouch of so he goes to find him, and together they go on a little journey to find that pouch of sand. You will find that it was John Constantine's former girlfriend actually has it, and there's a little bit of horror unfolds towards the end because of that.
Yes. So the first thing that occurs to me here is, like, how cynical is this insertion of Constantine? Again, I am always coming to Sandman of, from this mythological way that we've built it up as this work of literature. But Constantine had been introduced a year before. He was also under Karen Berger's editorial control, which eventually turns into Vertigo. And he was quite successful in his, he himself had been branched out from Swamp Thing. So, like, how cynical is it that Gaiman decides that the first of the tools is going to be with this character who's already got visibility, but doesn't live in like the main kind of child appropriate DC universe? Like, I wonder if he didn't exist, or if he hadn't been popular, would Gaiman have still used him, or would this be some nobody, or would he have just changed it to be like an ex-boyfriend of Zatanna's, so that there was that inherent linkage?
Right. So, from my understanding of the DC universe, very little knowledge. I'm not as knowledgeable as some of the other people we know. Isn't John Constantine is always kind of the link between the mystical side and the normal side of DC? Because I feel like, isn't he the person that Batman always goes to if he needs any kind of magical help?
Well, yes, and more, if you've ever read the initial introduction of him in Swamp Thing, Alan Moore sets him up that way, is that there's this kind of overarching, end of the world kind of thing happening that Swamp Thing needs to get involved in. And Constantine kind of just shows up in the swamp. He's like, right. Are you going to do something about this? So he's always written with a sort of preternatural awareness, like he's the one who's tapped in. And the few times that we get him, like, in the rest of the DC universe, he's kind of become that. He's that character that like taps them on the shoulder and goes, right, you should probably be worrying about this, which makes it, to me, even funnier that in this issue you have Sandman tapping him on the shoulder to say, right, like, we've got to go take care of this thing that you're not even aware of. Even your knowledge of the occult doesn't cover everything.
Right. So, and I don't know who else would fit in it, because now that I know that it's John Constantine, like, to me in my head, I'm like, this is it. That's perfect. So I wouldn't know who else, like, would have done the same job unless it's some nobody. Because if it's some nobody, I don't think that will have any effect and any like long-term effect on the story to you, because it's like, oh, okay, some guy just had the pouch. So I think having John Constantine in there, it's kind of ups the story, improves the quality of it. Also, and going back to issue 2, actually, we kind of get to see a little bit of Dream's kind of like, he doesn't care for men that much, because that's the first person he goes after is John Constantine, because he's the only human that has the three
get it over with.
So he always kind of like, he's like, oh, I'm gonna go after have a talk with the John Constantine. He's just a man. What could happen? Like, that's literally what he says. And that I'm like, oh, you know what? A man trapped you. You need to have some humbleness about you. But it seems like he didn't learn much from his captivity.
True, he does, and he continues to stumble into problems as we go on. Now, this issue has an interlude too in it, which seems to be kind of Gaiman's way of doing things right now, that there's kind of a different scene in the middle, but this scene winds up tying into the end. So we see this man robbing a house. Did you understand right away that the house he was robbing was the house where there was the sand? Like, I think it took me until the page turn to understand how this was going to be relevant to the rest of the issue.
No, I mean that's kind of I think the point was because first of all I was like, okay, what is he up to? Like where does this comes parachuting in? But then the next page, so in the very beginning, you kind of see that like there is a person who is in like who has the pouch at the very first page, and then when you go back to the second, when you coming back to the whole, when he's trying to enter is the same house. So the first page and then that house is the same. So when I page turn, I realized that, oh, is it that house? So I went back and kind of compared that. I'm like, okay, so he just entered the house that contains the pouch.
And by containing the pouch, the house has turned into this crossing point where dreams and reality are kind of merged, and things from the dream world, as we see when Sandman and Constantine get there, are coming through. And Dream says to Constantine, it's never only a dream, John Constantine. Here, less than some other places. And it's interesting because I hadn't really thought about Sandman as being able to manifest dream things in the real world. We've seen a lot of him like hopping into somebody's dream and traveling by that. And so this issue even brings to light a whole different layer of what he's capable of.
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons the tools are important to him, because he has capable, he has very limited capability without them. So without having the sands, he can't just manifest a dream out of something. He has to rely on people dreaming certain things, because even when in the second issue, when he was trying to call the three sisters, he had to find the elements in people's dreams. But however, if he had the pouch, he can probably just whip it out, just conjure a dream out of nothing. So that's one of the kind of like reasons for having these tools in the first place.
And also, so they kind of travel through the house and they find Rachel, Constantine's ex-girlfriend, and she's this kind of strange waking / dreaming zombie, which is the flip side of things that we saw in issue 1, that without Sandman, people got stuck in these kind of formless dream states, or they were stuck, unable to really have real sleep. Here's somebody who's effectively been like snorting dreams, like she's so close to the pouch. And it plays off of, Constantine is never a title or a character that shies away from things that are a little bit transgressive and drug culture. And so Sandman's making a very obvious metaphor here about somebody who's, maybe like a heroin addict, but instead she is just using the sand.
Right. So I think
dream junkie.
Dream junkie. Yeah, dream junkie. And I think like it's an effect. I don't think Rachel knew what she was doing.
No.
Yeah, there was no way of I don't think that was kind of discussed over there. So it was like an effect to show that too much or too little. So in the first issue, we saw that what happens if it's too little of it, and what's the issue effect when you are doing too much of it. So there was a little bit of that as well. But what was really interesting was that the sand started escaping and becomes take over and then starts becoming reality. So that was I thought was a very interesting and freaky concept.
Yeah, and I really got something interesting out of these 3 chases of the tools, because I have read a little bit into the stuff we're going to cover next week, is that each one seems to be trying to tell us a little bit something about how Sandman and the power of dreams relates to someone kind of on the spectrum of power. So here's this very regular person, and even Constantine, who's like regular person adjacent.
Right.
She can't handle it. Like, it's way beyond her ability to handle, right? So then you get the next issue, which we'll go into, where we see somebody very supernatural, a concept as old or older than Sandman, and how that relates to the power of Sandman's tools. And then we kind of get someone in the middle with Dr. Destiny.
Right. So one of the things I was kind of thinking about it, as we were talking about the tools and stuff, so do you think that he created kind of like a Horcrux, going back to the Harry Potter reference?
Yeah.
Horcrux, one of those tools that he actually had all of those, but he kind of relinquished some of it just to kind of keep parts of him alive.
It's a really interesting concept, because it gets into, and I don't know this, like what the origin of the tools were. Were they things that he created through the force of his will, I don't know. So it's hard to say. But then to your point, like if they had been destroyed or all used up, would he have ever been able to come back?
Right. So I don't know. I mean, it's not. I don't recall they talk about it anymore. Like, you know, the tools are used, but I don't know if they talk about the origin of it. But I'm gonna keep an eye out for it when I read further on, because that kind of piqued my interest a little bit.
So in the chat, Philip, keeping us honest for a second week, points out that Rachel knew that it was magic, but John said she always asked him not to open it or use it, and he was always smart enough not to use it. I love that it's actually, I think, fun and like helpful that there are people that have the issues in front of them as we're yammering to be like, wait a second, and ends up again.
Yeah, but that's true that she knew it was magic, but did she know what kind of magic? Because this is not magic. That's way beyond magic. Because, you know, I think it's mystical power. So that's, you know, that's a little different. But yeah, but, you know, I honestly forgot those lines.
Yeah, and Brendan points out that they do point out that she was kind of had a destructive lifestyle beforehand as well. I think they do allude to that. So this issue ends on a really interesting note. You know, Constantine is always such a hard ass all the time. And it ends with him very bashfully asking for two things from Sandman. First, he asks if Rachel can die peacefully, and Sandman kind of excuses Constantine from the room so that she can. And then even more bashfully, he says, well, I don't like to ask for favors, but if they don't owe me something, I mean, I don't want to. And he's like stammering and stammering. And he asks if Sandman can take care of his nightmares. And he does. He says that, you know, that it won't be a problem anymore.
Yeah, but so speaking of the nightmares, is that kind of comes from any of the John Constantine stories? Because I think, like, you know, he mentioned something about Newcastle.
Yeah.
So is that part of the story, like Constantine's story?
I don't know. We'd have to page one of our Constantine experts from the Omnibus Collectors group, because I don't know Constantine that well to say. I mean, he had only had about 12 issues at this point, so I don't know if they had established that much canon for him.
Okay, because I really actually liked the ending. Like, once again, like the heartbreak ending kind of continues here as well, because especially Rachel's death was like, it was very sweet. It kind of shows, like, you know, despite being all powerful, Dream has a soft side to him, because, you know, just like he makes sure that Rachel passes peacefully and happily, he also puts the sheet on her head. Like, you know, I thought that it has a little bit of soft touch, and, you know, he could have easily said, no, she stole my pouch and I'm going to punish her for that, but he actually didn't. And to me, that kind of shows another side of him, that despite being all powerful, he does have a little bit of kindness in him.
As we were discussing this issue on the chat, folks were talking about the short-lived Constantine television series. Kind of funny, because now we're going to talk about Lucifer, also who has a television series right now based on this character. And it makes me smile, because, you know, the Constantine in the TV series is much more faithful to comic Constantine than the Keanu Reeves movie, which I actually love as a movie, but it doesn't really feel like Constantine as much. And then you were talking about how you enjoy him in all of the cartoons, and it's kind of an echo of what we were talking about with the Furies in the previous issue of these all these different story versions of all the different characters, and how they're all existing on a continuum and have some things in common, which in turn makes me think of Unwritten, which is a modern Vertigo series that very much deals in that, you know, the power of narratives and the power of people's interest and belief in different versions of narrative to kind of strengthen the thing that is its own symbol. That's by Mike Carey, right? Yes, I love it, because I love Mike Carey. Right. So you should read The Girl with All the Powers. Or I have to read it. It turns out The Girl with All the Gifts. The Girl with All the Gifts, yeah. The Girl with All the Gifts, yes. It's amazing. It's amazing. After you mentioned it to me, I mentioned it to my wife, and she apparently loves the movie and didn't even know that the movie and originally the text had been written by Mike Carey, who she knows from me carrying on about how great he is all the time. Right. So yeah, I mean, I recently found out that the Unwritten, my library has all of the 10 volumes or however many. So I'm planning on kind of getting that attacking that at some point. Unwritten is a wonderful midpoint between Sandman and Harry Potter, actually. It's DC started it in a hardcover deluxe format and then hasn't followed up, which is a pity, because the art, which is largely by Peter Gross, is just totally gorgeous. I have I don't know what moved me to buy it. I guess I just read Mike Carey writing X-Men Legacy at the time, and it was so good. And so I said, who's this Mike Carey? And I picked up the Unwritten, and I just became obsessed with it. But I haven't read the last few. So actually, that's something I would, if there's any big Unwritten fans out there, I would love to do an Unwritten reading club after or parallel to Sandman, or maybe I can track you through it as you're doing your read if you decide that you enjoy it.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, you know, I'm all for, like, you know, yapping away on the internet, talking about the things I love. So I am more than happy to do that. All right, so shall we move? Like, is there any questions before we move to issue number 4?
No, nobody had too much to say about issue number 3. So why, other than that they liked it. So let's jump into issue number 4. So what does this issue entail? I'll say it's by far my favorite one so far.
Well, clearly you haven't read issue 6 yet.
Oh.
So I'm just kidding. I'm teasing. So in this issue, Dream travels to hell, literally. And he's trying to find his next one, which is the helmet. I don't think it kind of shows what the helmet does, other than giving him a little bit of anonymity. So he travels to hell to find it. And in the beginning, he talks about, like, how he has to deal with Lucifer, who is David Bowie. Like, let's all agree with on that. You know, it's not, there's no other way about going in. And then that how Dream knew him when he fell. So, and, like, you know, how he fell, and he still looked proud as he was falling. So it's actually the devil or Lucifer and all of whatever you talk about it. So he travels to hell, and then he meets up with Etrigan. Etrigan is also one of my favorite characters, and I knew Etrigan. Like, so.
Okay, see, I didn't. The first time I read this, I did not know him.
So Etrigan is, like, you know, in the animated DC animated universe, Batman and Etrigan are kind of gets dangled together oftentimes, and it's like hilarity ensues. So I love, and he has, like, a soft spot for Etrigan all the time. There's one episode where they all turn into kids, and Etrigan also gets turned into kids, and he was overtly protective of him, like Batman. And to me, it was one of the sweetest story ever. I love it. So. And in that, actually, the House of Mystery, where Abel and Cain lives, shows up in there too. So, and I think that Cain is, like, very similar to the storyteller in that. Sorry, I digressed. But anyway, so Etrigan takes him to Lucifer's castle, only to find out that Lucifer now has 2 other people that helps him run hell. So they kind of together, they said, okay, we'll help you. They find the demon who has the helmet. Then there's, like, a very interesting kind of battle ensues, which is of imagination. Let's say it's a creativity battle, and obviously. He wins the helmet, and then Lucifer tries to keep him, but he's like, well, I'm more powerful than you're ever gonna be, because what is hell if you don't have, like, none of you have any power over your occupants unless they dream of heaven. So, and then, you know, he parts away when Lucifer says, someday I will destroy you. It was very walking to the sunset moment.
This issue is so dense with thematic content. Like, each point that you mentioned, there's a few that you didn't even touch upon because it's just so much happens. I was like, oh, I want to talk about that. Oh, I want to talk about that. So it starts out with Sandman saying that he witnessed the fall of Lucifer, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about in issue 2 with, like, can stories happen without dreams? Can dreams happen without stories? And it kind of implies that Sandman was a concept, dream was a concept that existed even before there was necessarily humanity, which I think is an interesting thread there.
Because Kryptonites were dreaming about him. That's why, right. You know, like, there was Kryptonites, like Kryptonians before Earth people. So that's why, I think.
Well, also this idea that the dream is linked to imagination, which he touches on at the end when he says that great quote, what power would hell have if those here imprisoned were not able to dream of heaven? And right. You know, it's an interesting connection between even the creators, even anybody who can have a concept of something that they want to bring forth into the world. Isn't that a dream?
Right. So Yeah, and the thing is, like, one thing I really want to talk about, like, we didn't touch so too much about art in the previous issues, but over here it seems all like like, I found it to be very interesting because it has a lot of details to them, especially all the character designs for when there's like millions of demons were brought in, each and every one of them.
Overwhelming. There's so many, and there's no two that are the same.
Right. So if you all can kind of see this big splash page over here, it's amazing, and every single one of them is different. And then there's like next page, a couple of pages later, there's like a Hellfire Club where they go to have their duel, like their battle, and even in there's like different kind of monsters that wasn't in the previous page. So I thought that was very, like, creative and imaginative. I don't know whether it's like how much input Gaiman had. It was probably like, the artist who's probably like should be given all the credit for.
Well, and this is the kind of stuff that Sam Keith absolutely specializes in. So this is, I think we talked a little bit last episode, if we felt like he really fit in with Sandman, and somebody in the comments brought up that he himself did not feel he was a great fit for the series, and ultimately the penciling duties passed to the current inker, and we didn't know that fact reading it. And but this issue very much feels like if Sandman was always going to have this kind of vibe, this kind of horrific, hellish vibe, he would have been a terrific fit, because this is really the place where he exists. And I think part of the way that manifests is his drawings of Etrigan. He draws him in a very kind of Kirby standard way at first, and then on the next page, as he speaks to Sandman, he gets like scarier and more demonic, and he transforms him. And just a plot point, because I actually had to look this up, I found that his rhyming was more complex here than usual. It's not just normal couplets. And so I was like, where did that all come from? Has he always been that complex, or is this a Gaiman thing? And it turns out that he just had started rhyming in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run with issue 26, because he was promoted in Hell, which Dream actually refers to here. So just one of these other threads of like all of these pre-Vertigo books that we today think of Vertigo referring to each other and picking up their threads, that Gaiman plucked this Alan Moore plot and he's now threading it in through his Sandman run.
Yeah, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing is kind of one of my list of things to read, because it has so much like effect on like DC proper, or like even in the TV, like, in the animated universe. So I feel like I need to up reading, like, move the reading of it like much earlier than I'm hoping for.
Well, and that's for that same reason I read Grant Morrison's Animal Man last month. I was just like tired of not getting the jokes. And I was like, all right, let's learn. So as Etrigan leads him through Hell, we find that Hell holds horrors even for Dream, even for the Endless, because Etrigan leads him past a former lover from 10,000 years ago.
Right.
And that's shocking. Like, Sandman, as you've pointed out, has expressed such disdain for humans and kind of has looked at them as inconsequential. So to think of him being in love with a mortal was quite surprising for me.
So I don't think she is immortal, because I think I don't think so, because she comes back later. And if I think who she is, then she's also another entity who's not endless, but it's kind of like a one tier less than that, I think. Now I can't. I'm just.
Well, we can't know what we don't know yet. All we can do is speculate.
I mean, the thing is, like, because there's another character that shows up later on. Like I said, I don't remember the whole of it, but I remember little bits and pieces of it. And I remember her story to be very interesting, that it kind of stuck in my head. So if those two are the same person, then I don't think she's immortal.
Well, it seems like she will reappear in Season of Mists, which is one of the most famous Sandman stories that we're still several episodes away from. So we'll get there. But I think there were several layers of fascination there. The fascination that even Dream was vulnerable to the horrors of Hell. The fascination that he could ever fall in love. Like, I kind of just thought that he would be above such, human concepts. It kind of just, it was a page that told us a lot about the character without saying anything. And it goes to that kind of like show, don't tell. Gaiman imparted a ton of information in just a few panels without ever saying any of the things outright.
Right. And the thing is also, too, one of the things to point out, that some of the hellscape, I guess that's the way to say it, like, all the sceneries of Hell is actually inspired by Dante's Inferno. So he took a lot. I mean, obviously, anytime you do hell, you are inspired by Dante's Inferno. I think Preacher was as well. So yeah, it's like it has a lot of influence from that. And I think the Suicide Forest is something that's that is like, you know, directly from Inferno, Dante's Inferno.
It's actually one of my weirdly one of my favorite books. I said earlier that I really love religious fiction, and I love the prose of Dante's Inferno and reading different translations of it. So
this is gonna sound super snob, but you know, when one of the museum in Paris I went to, they have this like one of the this sculpture, and that captures entire Dante's Inferno in one wall. So if you just stare at it,
I don't remember seeing that, and I went to a ton of museums when I was in Paris.
Okay, so I think it was like the one with the clock. Someone
Musée d'Orsay.
So you know the one with the sorry, d'Orsay. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That's the one. So if you go, just walk in, and it's in the other side of that. And I kind of stood in front of it for an hour, and my sister's like, "You're not a snob. Stop doing that."
No, I had some of those same experiences as I went to some of those museums that I just was awestruck by some of the art. I love the statue of Nike, Winged Victory. There was a beautiful copy of it at my college where I attended. And when in the Louvre, she's in this beautiful hall with this big archway. And when I saw her, I was like transfixed, and I just started to cry. And it's like, I'm somebody who cries at art. I've always been like that, even before having a child, which I think makes you even more of a softie sometimes. But I was just so overwhelmed with seeing it in person. So I completely understand that.
Yeah, to me, it was actually the Jesus Christ, Pieta, by, what's his name? Oh no, I'm forgetting it. But anyway, that guy, the only famous Italian painter. Yeah, but hey everyone, welcome to museum chat with Fariha and Peter.
I love it though, because these are all of the references that are kind of like embedded in Sandman. And if I may take us on a brief digression about my favorite rock star, David Bowie, who, if people have been watching the videos that I do daily, that have the Crushing Crisis music or Crushing Comics music on them, that song is called Glam, and you don't hear the lyrics at the beginning because it cuts out, but the first line is, "When I was 16, I thought I was David Bowie." So I have a deep, deep love and appreciation for him. And the version of him that we see here in Hell, I'll hold it up again while I speak, I know Freya showed it earlier, is it's not the David Bowie image that many people are familiar with, which is like the Ziggy Stardust era David Bowie, or the Thin White Duke era David Bowie from later in the 70s, or even the kind of suited David Bowie from the Let's Dance era of the 80s. This is David Bowie that's very much Space Oddity David Bowie, before he was popular in America. And that album came out in 1969. Him with like the big glowing globe of hair, and he was androgynous in a different way. Ziggy Stardust was very kind of like intentionally androgynous to make you think about him playing with androgyny, but David Bowie was always this kind of androgynous figure. And he himself liked to play in this idea of different narratives through time, not only because of the characters he picked up, but at that time he was really into commedia dell'arte, which is this idea that there's archetypes for every story, and they're very similar in a way to the Endless. There's, you know, the lover, the brute, the comedian. And David Bowie actually was a student of this kind of art and theater. So I think that's such an interesting through line to have him here, and to have him as this very mercurial Lucifer, because it just kind of adds to the mythology of David Bowie. And just seeing that face on the page as somebody who is like a David Bowie obsessee historian led me to unpack all of those influences and infer all of that into Lucifer as somebody who kind of takes on many different images over time, in the same way Madonna does, and the same way, to go to American Gods, that media does.
So did you find any kind of reason why they chose David Bowie for this? Was it like, you know, is it because of Neil Gaiman's relationship with him, or was it, you know, kind of, did he give permission, or what was their history behind that?
You know, I don't always know a lot of the background here, and I kind of find it out afterwards as we're talking about it, or people leave comments. But I think it has to do with David Bowie, even though he was very sexual and he also was very androgynous, he wasn't overtly sexual in the way of like Elvis Presley
Okay.
was overtly sexual, or even the Beatles at points were sexual. He did that in his songs, but his image didn't tend to be as much about that, although now I'm thinking about the cover of Diamond Dogs, but I digress on that point. And so I think it was just like a really perfect way to show somebody who is androgynous and has this kind of power of allure to him, and that also that we could totally buy would be an image that we knew from the real world, whether it was Lucifer playing in the real world as David Bowie, or whether he's just choosing to take on that image for symbolic reasons. And as I said, I think it's an echo of American Gods. And as somebody just pointed out in the chat, how funny that Tilda Swinton's Angel Gabriel in the movie Constantine, Tilda Swinton always looks like David Bowie, but she absolutely is made to look just like Lucifer in this issue with her white clothing and her wings. So yet another like metatextual tie to Sandman.
And I haven't seen American Gods yet, but Gillian Anderson,
yes,
isn't
my
she
favorite.
also kind of made to look like David Bowie in it? Because from looking at the pictures of her, she does look like that.
Yeah, and so there's this hilarious like through line across all of these Neil Gaiman Vertigo works of David Bowie now.
So, and you know, and this is also going to show my dumbness. So, you know, I'm not into music, not to that level, you know. So I grew up with Michael Jackson because my mom loved Michael Jackson.
Me too.
When he passed away, so it was that level. So anyway, so I didn't know anything about David Bowie or who he is. My first introduction to David Bowie was, guess what? It was through The Prestige, Christopher Nolan movie. I was like, who is this? He was not very good in it, right? So
like, we can still be friends, but I don't know how I feel about that statement.
Right. He wasn't very good in it, and I'm like, why did Christopher Nolan would put this guy, like, you know?
But I think that's it's the same thing as Gaiman using him, is that he stands for so much more as a symbol, and whether or not you like his performance as Tesla, he brings all of this otherworldliness to it that not only he delivers in his face, but that is implied if you have any kind of knowledge or relationship to David Bowie's music.
Right. And then so after looking at that, then I kind of went down to the whole rabbit hole of who this person is, because I'm like, oh, he's gonna be a nobody. And then I'm like, oh my God, that was David Bowie. So yeah, it was one of those like, oh, you uncultured idiot.
Well, you know, nobody can know every culture, like, and every cultural reference. Like, I like to think that I'm this cultural critic who gets all of this stuff. And like, even in Sandman, you're pointing out things that totally went by me. I think that's part of the fun. So let's get to the real meat of this issue, which is I think of it as the Wizard's Duel, because I don't know if the first place this has ever happened is in this movie, but it's duplicative of a duel called the Wizard's Duel in Disney's animated feature, The Sword in the Stone. Merlin gets in a duel with a witch, and they have to turn themselves into different animals. But since this is in Arthurian times, the witch has no knowledge of biology to the state of like germs. And so Merlin defeats her, turning into a dragon by becoming a germ. Now here, it's actually, the demon who does that. He is the one who becomes Anthrax to defeat the bull. And then it like continues to escalate. And I think it's funny because Sandman, right after that, his little top hat that he's been wearing almost is drawn a little bit more like a witch hat, which made me think that it was maybe even like a little hidden reference to the duel in Sword in the Stone.
Right. So I kind of looked up that duel thing as well, like, you know, to see that. And apparently, like, people were saying that it was a game and original, but from to what you were telling me that it's not. But what I really liked was the top hat, because it's like, you know, he's without a top hat, and then all of a sudden he just shows up with a top hat.
Well, it's kind of this like heightened reality of like Lucifer's like, we're going to the Hellfire Club, and then they're there, and it's a jazz club, and Sandman's in a top hat.
Yeah, so he that's what I'm saying. Like, how does he know about that he needs to have a top hat in a club like that? So that's kind of like, I thought was a little funny thing, because he kind of does the same thing in the previous issue when John Constantine tell him you're gonna look stupid wearing that, and he kind of changes himself into this like trench coat and stuff, kind of like, get all proper and stuff. So I kind of like this moment of levity in this like really hot, like, like really, what you call it, like scary scenarios, that he's in hell, but he remembered to bring his top hat.
Well, and he says that even though it's this very imaginary setting, he says, I smell spit, alcohol, stale smoke, and cheap sex, perfume, and mold, and I feel the grass between my hooves, the flanks between my legs. All is real, nothing is real, and Tronzons move. So it's the sense that even there's these different levels of reality. There's the level where they're in the club, but the club itself is just a facet of hell. And then also each time that they're saying, I become the horse, I become the bull, I become the snake, it's like they're in a way physically manifesting in that. And it kind of drives home that there is danger here for Dream, that if he's outmaneuvered or outflanked, that the same fate that it will have for his creature or animal in the duel will somehow be reflected upon him as well.
Right. So, in the end, when he wins, the monster is taken away by agony and ecstasy. Is that a reference from something? Because I feel like I've heard about them somewhere before.
No, I mean, I think it's probably a reference to some kind of class, probably some other poem, some Dante level poem has agony and ecstasy, but I don't know it in full. But I want to go to a moment right before that, because it's such an interesting commentary on DC continuity. So Sandman Dream says he's the universe in order to outplay the demon saying he's a nova. And then the demon says, I am anti-life, the beast of judgment. And clearly that's a nod, whether again to Jack Kirby in this issue with Darkseid and the anti-life equation. And then Dream says, I am hope. And I think that's really interesting. If anyone's been reading Mr. Miracle, currently Tom King's run, which is punctuated with these Darkseid is panels, and they're just black. And it's that the hopelessness of Darkseid persists, and it's pervasive, and it kind of is constantly thrumming in the background of your life. And I don't know if Mr. Miracle and Barda right now would tell you that hope is enough to defeat the anti-life equation. But then as you're following them through this series, their strength really is drawn from hope. And so I just thought that, Gaiman here makes an interesting nod to the New God stuff from Kirby, and that, that exists on a continuum that is currently coming out on a monthly basis, even from Tom King and Mitch Gerads' Mr. Miracle series.
Yeah, that's also one of the things that I kind of lack my knowledge on, that, I'm not very familiar with the Jack Kirby or the Fourth World or all of that. I tried to kind of get into it a little bit, but then I can't deal with old-timey dialogue. I'm sorry.
I know that I have Sherlock as my phone a friend if I need Fourth World answers, because he's got it committed to me.
He tried really hard to get me into it. So I'm kind of waiting to see a collected edition of Mr. Miracle by Tom King. And I love anything Tom King ever wrote. Even if he wrote like whatever, I'll be like, yeah, that was the best thing ever. So I'm waiting to kind of read that, and then if maybe kind of finally bite the bullet and read about Jack Kirby's, that aspect of DCverse.
Well, that brings us to the end of this issue. Sandman, I'm trying to get in the habit of calling him Dream, wins the duel. And as you alluded to earlier, Lucifer attempts to keep him there, but he says, what power does Dream have? If there was no dream of heaven, there wouldn't be hell. And he leaves. And we get an epilogue that I don't want to talk about too much. It teases the next couple of issues. So we're going to do this one more time next week and talk about issues 5, 6, 7, and 8, which brings us to the end of the Preludes and Nocturnes initial arc of Sandman. And there's no guarantee that we're going to keep doing it after that. So whether you're watching live right now or you happen to be seeing this as an archive or a replay, definitely, leave a comment, tell us stuff that we missed, tell us how wrong we were, because that lets us know that we should definitely keep doing the Sandman 75 issues plus a couple of stories on the side. So we could probably continue doing this for like 10 or 15 weeks and work our way through all of Sandman.
Right. And one of the things I want to say that, this, the first 8 issue is this is Sandman. This is what Sandman is all about. So if you love it, you're going to love rest of it. So I can guarantee that, because it's kind of sets the world, sets Sandman, like, you know, Dream, and then just dive deeper into it. That's kind of like it's like a peak of the roller coaster ride. You know, when you're just beginning, like you at the end of 8, you're just sitting there and then waiting, and then it just goes woo. So,
oh, that makes me really excited, because I know I've read to 20 before, but I really don't remember anything past 8. So I'm really excited to go back and read some more. So I hope everybody tunes in. Same sand time, same sand channel next week. Bring your questions, bring your points of discussion, and join us both as we dig in further to Neil Gaiman's Sandman here on my channel as a part of Crushing Comics. Faria, thank you so much for joining me once again and being my delightful co-host.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun. So, you know, we'll try our best to continue.
Yes, and we will see everybody back here next week. Take care, everyone.
Bye.